Hi, welcome to our lecture on terms of direction. This is the first part of Chapter 1, and here we're going to be taking a look at how we talk about the location of different body parts. We're going to begin actually with a little bit of an introduction to anatomy. So we're going to start off with some definitions. What is anatomy, first of all? Well, of course, anatomy is the study of organismal structure. And I do want to include that word organismal in there because we could study biological structure at smaller levels or larger levels. And here we're kind of taking a look at the level of the organism. Now we might take a look at some cellular structures, and we may take a look at the tissue level, of course, but we're largely concerned about organs and organ systems in this class. Interestingly enough, the root of anatomy actually is to cut up. So anatomy in its origin is kind of like to dissect. And of course, this is how we gain anatomical knowledge. So it makes sense that as we look at the origin of the word, it might be related to the concept of dissection. Now, etymology, the study of the origin and history of words, is going to come up a lot in class. If we take a look at where a word came from, it often helps us associate words with the parts that they are meant to describe. So we kind of just want to take a look at what a word means, and that's what I'm going to be talking about when I talk about the etymology of a word. All right, we want to take a look at physiology, which you are either taking with anatomy now or will probably be taking after it. And this is the study of organismal function. And we do want to recognize that these two things, of course, are linked together. So anatomy and physiology cannot completely be separated. Even if we put them in different courses, we need to know the anatomy of the cardiovascular system before we can really understand the function of it. And we see over there someone taking blood pressure relating to the idea of putting pressure from the outside on arteries, which of course carry blood away from the heart and therefore are pressurized by the contractions of the ventricles of the heart. All right, we have a couple of different kinds of anatomy we could look at. We could look at microscopic anatomy, which is going to be structures that cannot be observed with the unaided eye, and therefore where we're going to need a microscope. Over here to the right, we see a particular tissue. This one has goblet cells and microvilli. Goblet cells produce mucus. Microvilli increase surface area. That kind of leads me to believe that this is from our intestine, an organ that is about absorption and where we're going to pass food through it. We actually are going to learn a name for this tissue later on. It is a non-ciliated, simple columnar epithelium. Okay, so we're going to spend most of our term looking at gross anatomy. Gross anatomy, as you can see in this picture, is pretty gross. So kind of makes sense to think about it in that way. But it really just means anatomical structures that are visible to the unaided eye, such as the liver, the gallbladder, the stomach, the pancreas, and numerous arteries coming off of the celiac trunk. So all of those are going to be gross anatomical features. And we could study those in a number of different ways. We could look specifically at surface anatomy on the outside of the body. We could take a regional approach where we learned everything within a particular location, but we're largely going to be taking a systemic approach to learning anatomy in this class. Now we are going to be taking a look at multiple organ systems, and you can see them listed here. Interestingly enough, the male and female reproductive systems are listed separately. We're actually going to learn that to a large extent, those are built from the same structures that we start off with as we begin developing as an embryo. So there are a couple of interesting and unique structures in there. You might already be familiar with those. That would be the uterus and uterine tubes in the female and the vas deferens in the male, which do not have a homologous structure, meaning coming from the same origin in the opposite sex. So that's kind of what we have coming up ahead of us this semester. Before we get to that, we need to know how to talk about the body, and we're going to begin with what we call the anatomical position. Now you can see a woman here standing in the anatomical position, and I think that that's actually the easiest way to remember it. So in the anatomical position, a person is standing upright. That means even if you're laying down, we consider your head to be above your feet as far as when we're talking about body parts. The feet are, of course, parallel. They are flat on the floor. They are facing forward, the head is level, the eyes are facing forward, the arms are at the side, and this is kind of a key to this, the palms are forward. You could also think about the thumbs as being out, or as we will later learn, lateral. Now the last one here doesn't apply to this particular person here, but in the anatomical position, the penis is erect. And that's just because our penis happens to hang off the body like another appendage, and we need to have a reference for the position of it to describe the tissues that are inside of it. It's going to have 3 erectile tissues, 2 paired tissues, and 1 singular tissue. And we need to know which of those is on the posterior and which of those is on the anterior surface. And we hold over terminology from quadrupeds, 4-legged animals. And that kind of means that in the flaccid penis, the tissues that face forward or ventrally are actually the dorsal tissues, the tissues that would face towards the back in, say, a dog or a horse. So we're going to take a look here at some planes and sections. We want to first understand the difference between those. Sections refer to an actual cut or slice, and we can see a section that has been done to a head down below there so that we can see some of the structures inside of it. Planes refer to imaginary flat surfaces passing through the body, and we see those passing through that woman there, much like she has shower doors that have kind of gone through her body. So our fundamental planes are going to be coronal, then we're going to have transverse and sagittal. We're taking a look here at the coronal or frontal plane, and that arrow is pointing to that particular plane. Now, this is the one we have the most trouble seeing going through the body because what it's doing is dividing the body into front and back portions. So, in other words, it is separating the back part of her body from the front, and we can see a coronal section down below here. This is actually allowing us to look at these ventricles, these hollow spaces in the brain, so you can imagine how valuable it is to perform a section like this. And so if we were to do this, if you were to imagine starting at the top of your head and cutting your face off by cutting down towards your chin and removing your entire face, that would be a coronal section. Here we see the transverse plane, and the transverse plane, or a horizontal plane or cross section, is going to divide the body into superior and inferior portions, superior being towards the top, inferior down towards the feet. And we see an example of that down here. Now we can actually see the spinal cord really nicely here inside the vertebral canal, and we see large numbers of neck muscles here. So there are some good things we can see from a transverse plane, but because of how you cut through muscles in a transverse section, it can actually be kind of confusing to look at. You can imagine doing a transverse cut through the thigh. If you cut near the knee, or if you cut higher up, you're going to get dramatically different views. Then we have one here right through the middle. This is the mid-sagittal plane. Now, we talk about sagittal plane, and that is the kind of generalized version of it. Mid-sagittal is through the imaginary middle of the body. Now, we are a bilaterally symmetrical organism, so we do have left and right sides, and we do essentially have a middle, but nobody is perfectly symmetrical. So mid-sagittal is a little bit of an imaginary plane. A sagittal plane, though, could be off to the side, and we would generally refer to that as a parasagittal plane. We can see a sagittal section down below here, and you can see that I don't see the nasal septum, that little section that divides our nostrils into a left nostril and a right nostril, but I can see what we call the nasal conchae here. So these are some bones that provide additional surface area inside our nose and are visible because we've done a mid-sagittal cut, and that has left one side at least without the septum because we didn't cut perfectly down the center. All right, we do have one final plane or section, and it's referred to as the oblique plane. It's not one of our learning goals here, but we do want to be aware that if you cut diagonally through a structure, you're going to take a structure that would be round in cross-section, or where we would only see the sides of it in what we call a longitudinal section, and you're going to end up with an oval. Now, the structure is not oval-shaped. The oval comes as a result of cutting diagonally through it. But you can imagine if we have a tube running through our body, which is a nice round tube, but twists. we're going to cut it in all kinds of different directions, and we have to be aware that when we look at something where we've made a slice through it, we're going to see all kinds of different views if that tube was twisting around. All right, that does bring us to our main topic for this particular lecture, terms of directions. We need to know a couple of things before we get started. Number one, terms of direction come in pairs. So proximal and distal are a pair. They are the opposite of each other. Now these are also relative, meaning that something could be proximal compared to one body part, but distal compared to another. So an example of that would be that my wrist is proximal, and proximal will mean closer to an origin or attachment site to my fingers. But my wrist is distal compared to my elbow, which is closer to where my arm attaches to my body. So my elbow is proximal relative to my wrist. A little bit of playing around with this will make this pretty easy. I do want to point out additionally that as we're learning these, I'm going to go ahead and continue to use these terms as if we've always really known them. So that's kind of an important thing. We need to imagine that I must learn these terms as if they are colors, or if they are terms like left and right, the same kind of things we would learn in kindergarten. All right, we're going to begin here with a couple of easy ones, anterior and posterior. So in this case, this red dot is posterior relative to the blue dot. The blue dot, therefore, is anterior relative to the red dot. Now, interestingly, we do have some synonyms for these. Ventral is a synonym for anterior, so I could say that the blue dot is ventral compared to the red dot, and that the term dorsal, meaning towards the back, is of course a synonym for posterior. So in this case, the red dot is dorsal as compared to the blue dot. Sometimes we really just mean at the back or at the front, and we do tend to use ventral and dorsal in those particular times. But these are, for our purposes, going to be interchangeable, anterior or ventral, posterior or dorsal. Our next set of terms is superior and inferior. Superior meaning towards the head or above, inferior meaning towards the feet. So in this case, we've got our location of the yellow dot relative to the red. The yellow is above. We would therefore say it is superior to the red dot. The red dot, therefore, is inferior to the yellow dot. Now, we do want to be aware that we might see a couple of other terms that are associated with these. They are generally used in quadrupeds, not bipeds, two-legged animals like ourselves, but cranial is a good synonym for superior. So we might refer to, say, the top of our collarbone, our clavicle, as the cranial surface of our clavicle. Now, we don't have as good of a synonym for inferior. So the thing that is usually associated with cranial is caudal as its antonym, which means towards the tail. Now, if we think about this, towards our tail isn't necessarily towards our feet, largely because we are a mostly tailless organism. And we actually use this on the liver as the caudate lobe of the liver, and it kind of means posterior in that case, so that can be a little confusing. Our next pair is deep and superficial. Deep meaning towards the inside or under a structure, superficial meaning on the outside or closer to the origin or closer to the surface, sorry. The location of yellow relative to blue, of course, would be superficial. Now, this gets kind of interesting and tricky. We're taking a look at the skin here. The blue is in a layer of the skin called the dermis. The dermis is deep to the epidermis, which is where that yellow dot is. Epi means above or upon, so of course that would be a superficial area. Interestingly enough, this area with the dead skin, this dark area, and this area down here all the way to this layer of cells, that's all epidermis. So even within the epidermis, there are deep and superficial layers of the epidermis, even though they are all superficial to the dermis. And every one of those is superficial to the subcutaneous layer down below. Our next pair is one of our most commonly used ones, medial and lateral. Medial meaning towards the middle of the body, and lateral meaning away from the midline of the body. So the location of yellow relative to blue, yellow is lateral as compared to blue, and blue is medial as compared to yellow. This is also an interesting pair in that obviously if you place the blue directly on that mid-sagittal plane through the body, you can't get any more medial than that. Our next pair is proximal and distal, and these may be the ones that you are the least familiar with. I know I was when I learned anatomy. Proximal means closest to the point of attachment, point of origin, or central point. Distal means the furthest from a point of attachment, point of origin, or a central point. So we're usually going to use these on limbs, but I could also use these things to talk about something like the intestine. The small intestine begins at the stomach, that would be the proximal end, and it ends where it connects to the large intestine, that would be the distal end. So let's take a look at our diagram here. We've got the location of yellow relative to red. Well, the yellow is proximal relative to the red. The red, of course, then is distal relative to the yellow. And as you can see, this would work even on a non-human organism, and it's an essential pair of terms for describing the location of things on our limbs, be that our arm or our lower limb.